Clint Eastwood's latest film boasts a pitch-perfect synopsis for a boxed-in drama or thriller, depending on how you choose to swing it. What if a member of a jury realized mid-trial that they may be guilty of the charges held against the defendant? Honestly, all the way up to the build-up to the trial, several scenes feel like they could make for an interesting and entertaining full feature. I'd personally love to see more of the jurors being interrogated by the prosecution and defense lawyers to determine if they're all suitable to be on an impartial jury, with each member feeling more and more like they're the ones on trial the more they're questioned. Coupled with the amusing futility of a few choice members desperately trying to get out of jury duty, only further proving to the judge that their lack of investment makes them ideal candidates. So the crime that they've all been called up for, the crime that James Scythe is on trial for, and Justin believes he's almost certainly guilty of, is the murder of Scythe's girlfriend, Kendall. Eastwood is pretty precise in his use of flashbacks, the shifts in perspective never radically altering the sequence of events, but also never showing the exact circumstances of Kendall's death. So we are left with an opening for more possibilities, but particularly in Justin's case, the lack of intent or realization of what he believes he did is a key motivator for him to not come forward and outright admit his guilt, instead hopeful for a scenario where everybody wins. The kicker there, of course, is that this dilemma is explicitly shown to be a no-win scenario. Despite the fact that James is a repeat offender, former drug dealer, and just generally has a bad reputation among the community, he is at risk of being convicted for a crime he is not guilty of committing. And while Justin is seen by all who know him as more morally upstanding, he has a promising life, married with a baby on the way, his history of alcoholism and DUIs means that even a willing confession, coupled with the fact that what happened was indeed an accident, means that his sentence would, same as James, almost certainly be for life. On top of all of that, it's widely accepted, of course, that Kendall's loved ones deserve some semblance of justice for her death. So the notion of James and Justin both walking free still can't really be seen as an everybody wins scenario, can it? Now obviously, with that being the premise, the ending we're driving towards as the trial begins and ends and the jury starts their deliberation is who's going down for the crime, so no spoilers on that front. But with everything laid out as it has been, I'm honestly not sure that the result itself says much more about the criticism of the legal process being offered in Juror number 2. That is all clarified in the proceedings. You can always hear a hint of sarcasm in the very ether of the film every time someone refers to the system of law they have as not perfect, but it's the best we've got. During the trial, the imperfections presented are wholly directed to the letter of the law, reducing the human beings under its scrutiny to units. In terms of priorities, character and circumstance are a distant second and third to the technicalities of written statutes, and therefore, regardless of whether they were written in the spirit of fairness and justice, they ultimately let down the people subjected to them. This is what drives Justin to keep his guilt from the courts. The law has spoken, no matter who it is, someone is going down for this. By the time we get to the jury room, we shift from the bureaucratic problems to the emotional problems, showing the way bias inevitably shapes even a supposedly impartial group. Now perhaps whenever a film gets to the commencement of an American jury debate and vote, it's simply inevitable that your mind's going to turn to 12 Angry Men. But everything seems very specifically blocked to evoke that film in particular. Having not seen the play, I've no idea if the same can be said for it. The foreperson being at the head of the table and going over the procedure for the other 11 jurors is a given, but add to that the most passionate and ardent juror to vote guilty is sat to her left a couple of seats down, the most eager to wrap it up and leave sitting at the foot of the table, and Justin, our one outlier for a not guilty verdict, is sat near the end of the right-hand side. It feels like it's calling specific attention to the comparisons, perhaps to offer up an alternate perspective. 12 Angry Men picks the process apart to argue for the vital importance of individual critical thinking within the system to ensure that the human element is never forgotten. Juror number 2, on the other hand, takes the regrettable but sometimes very realistic perspective that very few people will care to apply such thought in such a scenario. Marcus believes James should go to prison, based on James's history and his association with others he deems James to be like, and he is not confronted on being biased. Yolanda is frustrated and adamant that any attempts to sway the votes from guilty to not guilty is a waste of time brought on by guilt and is never called out for just wanting to get out of there as quickly as possible. And even our one outlier pleading for more consideration to be owed to a person whose life hinges on their decision, even he's got a selfish motivation for speaking out. What all of this said to me when I was watching the film was that Eastwood was more interested in confronting the faults of America's court systems than he was about the fates of the characters. And he makes an effective case for how a statement like, "it's not perfect but it's the best we've got," is an unacceptable show of complacency that damns more people than it protects. But on reflection after the credits rolled, I questioned my assessment on how interested he was in the fates of these characters, particularly when I thought about two possible ways this film could have been pitched. Number one, what if a man who has made mistakes in the past but is showing all signs of straightening up and flying right, who seems nice and has a loving family, had to pay for a crime he committed? Number two, what if a man accused of a violent crime, who has a history of violence and substantial evidence against him, actually didn't do it but is simply the victim of everyone thinking he's guilty? Looking at it from that perspective highlighted other details that threw into question its stance on questioning the integrity of the system. Prosecutor Faith Kilbrew, for instance, whose career has a lot to gain from winning the case, isn't so much presented as corrupted by her own desires, so much as she's presented as an attorney of integrity presented with a moral choice. The two aforementioned jurors who present the greatest obstacle to saving James from an unjust sentence are the only two black members of the jury, and J.K. Simmons plays another jury member, the first to back up the not guilty proposal, through a more analytical and professional perspective as a retired cop. His withholding his former career is frowned upon by due process, but the expertise he provides is cast in a positive light, and his prevention from further utilizing his investigative resources by the law is seen as a negative. Now, a lot of that might be projection based on what I do know about the director. From some details regarding his relationship history, to old and recent political statements, to the perspective of films like the Dirty Harry films, on the relationship between the letter of the law and true justice. All of these have something of an influence on what I believe a Clint Eastwood film may be prioritizing when it comes to who the true victims of the legal system are. Then again, Eastwood is by no means the only director to cast lead roles that resemble him within the parameters of race and gender, and while it's certainly true that Marcus and Yolanda are presented as the most antagonistic within the jury, the film doesn't omit their perspective, especially when the man they're most antagonistic towards, though they don't realize it, is the truly guilty party. And the 12 Angry Men comparisons aren't one-to-one. Juror number 3 in that film is confronted for conflating his son with the defendant, that being the key motivator for wanting to see the defendant punished. Whereas Marcus has a personal take relating to a loved one, but he's not projecting similarities between James and someone in his life. He's observed that James is affiliated with a drug ring that ruined a loved one's life. So his anger is more directly related to crimes he has been the indirect victim of, and he is thinking about the justice for the victim of this crime. Similarly, Yolanda isn't just trying to get out so she can catch the end of a ball game. She has kids that she is responsible for, and is consistently throughout the proceedings a much more active participant in the debate than the person I'm comparing her to. So while I'm left perhaps cynically feeling that the plea for truer justice may be skewed in one specific direction, it still can't be denied that juror number 2 aptly aims its ire at the tangled bureaucracy of the law itself, and how staunch obedience solely to it threatens to undermine the protection of its citizens more than uphold it.